Well, hello quilt friends, and welcome back to the Rose Garden Sew Along. We are on week 5, and this week we are going to be making this curved looking stem unit. So if you're making the single rose runner, you're going to learn how to make 2 of those this week, and if you're making the big quilt, there are 3 of them. But if you are making the double rose runner, you actually get to have the week off. So you can sit down and put your feet up or catch up if you're a little bit behind, and then next week we will finish assembling that runner. But for this week, we're going to be talking about doing the curved stem. And as a designer, when I started sketching out this pattern, it was a challenge for me to figure out a doable way to make that stem and make it look like it's curved without curved seams, without templates, and without Y-seams. So I was able to do it, but there are a few bias triangles to deal with, and so I've prepared a detailed tutorial for you on how that's all put together. So as you're going along with this week's lesson, make sure that you pay attention to how those little triangles are aligned, and that will help you quite a bit. And also just be as accurate as you can with your sewing. When I tell you to put the bias to the bottom and give you little hints, if you do those things throughout the process, you will have success in getting that arch stem to curve on you and to get this little intersection here lined up, and that's one of the more difficult intersections in the quilt. But I will walk you through every step of the way. And like I said, I've prepared a detailed tutorial. It's about 20 minutes, so I will walk you through that. And if you need to, pause the video and stop and practice as you go. And if you have any questions, you can always leave them in the comments for me and I will walk you through. So stay tuned for that video. Okay, so I am all set up over here on my cutting table. I have the leaf unit or the stem unit laid out that we are making for this week. So last week we made a bunch of leaves and these units, and if you remember, I said we're going to save a bunch of these leaves because we need them to make this stem unit here. So let's get started with that. If you are on the big rose garden pattern, this would be step 21. So that's where I'm looking at in my pattern because I'm doing the big quilt with the navy background. So what you're going to do is you're going to take some of your leaf blocks and you're going to sew one of your background pieces, to the side like this. Then we're going to use the folded corner technique and sew a green square. And this green square is going to match our stem that we have in one of our next steps. And then just make sure that you get the correct size of this leaf here or this folded corner here, because some of these are 1 3/4 and some are 1 1/2. So get the right size green square laid out. And then we are going to be sewing some background rectangles to this piece here. So I'm just going to trim this. I only have 3 of these stem units to make for the big quilt, so it's a little hard to have a step out for each step. So that's why I'm doing this like this. Normally I would press that before heading to the next step, but for demonstration purposes here. So next we're going to take out some of our background rectangles. These should be labeled with letters. So this is K, and we are going to put N over here. Now notice the direction that I have them turned, because it would be possible to sew this like this here. So pay attention to the direction that those are turned. And we're going to start out by sewing the K unit on first. So if you look in the diagram, this is step 22. So there's our diagram right there. We would like this to make a straight line along the bottom. So we're going to line those 2 up along the bottom. Now this blue edge of this triangle is bias. So my first hint to you with all of the bias triangles that we're going to be doing in this pattern is when you're sewing, always make sure this bias edge of the triangle here on the seam that we're sewing is to the bottom. So what I mean by that is when you go to the machine to sew, flip this over, because this leaf, this is all straight of grain on the edges, and keep that bias to the bottom. So what's going to happen then is the bias edge is underneath, and it's going to be less likely to stretch out. If you were to have it on the top and you were to start sewing here and working your way down the block, your foot is going to push that bias edge forward and it's going to stretch out as you're sewing. So if this were a really large triangle, there's a lot of room for it to stretch. And by keeping it on the bottom, the feed dogs will kind of work it in as you sew and will help reduce some of that stretch. So even if you have a dual feed foot or an even feed foot, you're still going to want to keep the bias to the bottom. So after you're done sewing, it's going to look like this. And notice this does not meet at the top here. You see that? But if we were to open this up, we get a nice straight line along the bottom here. Then we're going to add our next triangle. This is triangle N. Now in the diagram, do you see how we need this tip to line up with the bottom of the leaf point? So I find that a lot of people struggle with, where do I position this? So let's just flip it over. Where do I position this along this edge if I want those 2 points to line up along the bottom? So what I mean by that is, let's look at the one I've already sewn. Do you see how those points match up perfectly on the bottom and there's overhang to this side? How do I need to position my piece so that it lines up perfectly in that corner? And the trick is, I probably should have used red thread here, hopefully you can see it, that the 1/4 inch seam needs to come off right in the point where all of those intersections meet. And I think the easiest way to see this is to take a marking tool that's got a 1/4 inch marking on it and one of your fine tip marking pens, and just make a little 1/4 inch line there. I think I can come up closer here so you can see. And that's going to be where my seam line is. So what we're going to do is lay these right sides together, and then let's look for that little hash mark there, and you slide it back and forth until the line that you marked, I'm going to get up really close if I can, the line that you marked is even with the edge of the green block. Okay, I'm holding it real still. Do you see how that looks like it's nice and lined up? And then you're going to let the extra overhang. So once you get that position, I would put like a pin or a small dot of glue like I showed earlier so that that's held in place. Then you're going to go to the machine, and again you're going to keep the bias to the bottom. And if it bothers you that you can't see your little hash mark on the triangle anymore, you could mark it on this side as well. Whatever makes it easiest so that you get those pieces nice and lined up. Okay, so again, once it's sewn, do you see how my stitching line comes off right where it meets the edge of the green on this corner, and the excess overhangs up here? So you're going to get a block that looks like this. So down here I have already pressed this. So let's pull that onto screen. So it's going to look like that. Doesn't that look funny? We're used to matching up all of our corners, but you're going to have to trust me on this because we're going to do some trimming as we go along. Now we're going to take triangle M. That looks like this. And what we want to do is we want to position it again so that these edges make a straight line and any excess hangs this way. So you can see that in the last part of the diagram right here. See how that makes a straight line along the top? So again, we're going to lay these right sides together, and you're going to look for where your 1/4 inch seam would line up with the edge of the block underneath. So again, if you want to, you can mark this 1/4 inch line so that you have a reference for where that's supposed to be. I'll come closer to the camera so that you can see that marking. And that needs to line up with the edge of the navy here. Do you see how those two things are perfectly aligned? Now another trick that you can use when you get to the machine is you can start sewing with your needle in the down position. And once that needle is in the down position, when you start, you'll see if it's lined up with those intersections making that little valley there. And that will also help you to align those pieces. Now again, we have a long bias edge here on our navy triangle, so when you go to sew it, you're going to flip to this side and you're going to sew down this seam. Now I don't have another step with that sewn on, so I'm just going to lay it here, and you're going to imagine with me that this is what you're going to have, is a nice straight line along here and excess hanging off this direction. So that's what that unit is going to look like. So now what you're going to do is set this aside. We'll use it again a couple steps from now. And we're going to take out some more of our leaf blocks, and you should have some background pieces, 1.5 by 6.5, that are set aside for this step. So you're going to sew the background pieces and the leaves together like so. You're going to do another folded corner here. This is the 1.5 inch green square. And then after that's pressed, we are going to sew a strip like this. Now we have two strips that are very similar here. You want the 10.5 inch piece in length. The pattern does tell you this, so just follow along in your pattern. Then you're going to sew that stem to your leaf block like this. And this is the beginning of the arch of our stem. Here is that piece nicely pressed. Now throughout the pattern, you'll see that I give you proof sizes. So this should be 7.5 by 10.5. So what that means is you're going to want to take a ruler and lay it on top of your block and see, are you 7.5 in width and 10.5 in length here? And if not, you could do a tiny little bit of trimming. Hopefully it's a tiny bit, so that that's the correct size that it needs to be before moving on. Okay, next we are going to take our 1.5 by 11 inch green rectangle and some more of the M triangles that we used in our previous step. So this is the unit we're going to be making, and let me unpin this here so I've got another triangle. So what we want to do is we want to center this stem with our triangle here. And I think the easiest way to do that is to mark the center of each piece. You can do that by making a small snip with your scissor, or you can use a pin like I've done here. Again, you're going to mark the middle, and then you're going to line up the two middles. Now once they're laying right sides together, again, our green piece is straight of grain, our triangle is a bias edge, so when you sew, you're going to keep that to the bottom. Let's set that aside and grab the piece that I've sewn. Here you can see where my middle marking is. And then we're going to carefully press this over. So I press towards the green because I like my stems to pop a little bit after I've sewn all those pieces together. And then we're going to do a little bit of trimming with this triangle. So then you're going to take your ruler. You're going to make a 90-degree corner here. I can even just move the ruler up so you can see that there's my 90-degree corner. If your piece wings way out and this does not make a 90-degree corner, that means your bias stretched a little while you were sewing. I can see I have just a teeny bit up here that I can trim. You see how that little navy sliver came off? That's from a little bit of stretch happening in that triangle. But we're going to make sure that this is trimmed to a 90-degree corner, and you're going to have a unit that looks like that. Okay, so next we are going to put these two pieces together. Now you can see our triangle is a little bit short there, and it's supposed to be. What we're going to do is line up these two edges, and then we hope that these two intersections line up perfectly after we've sewn them. So they're going to make a straight line like this here. So because we dealt with a bias triangle here and there might be a little stretch, I would prefer to pin this. You don't have to, you can just lay them right sides together, line up this edge and sew. Again, you'd keep your bias edge to the bottom. But I know that the chances of this intersection, because that is a difficult intersection, it's actually one of the most difficult in the whole quilt. Because I know that that's unlikely to be perfect on its own, I'll show you the pinning technique that I use to make it fit and make it work. So I'm going to pin from the side that I'm going to sew. So straight of grain to the top. I'm going to put a pin 1/4 inch in from the edge of the block and along the edge of the green. Can you see the pin there? Hopefully, there you go. So I am going to now put that into the block below, right where my 1/4 inch seam line would cross the edge of the green. Hopefully you can see that. And then I'm going to push them together so that they're perfectly lined up. And I'm going to put a little stabilizer pin in front. You can put one in back if you want to, but it's going to look like this, where this pin is loose and this pin is in there. I'm going to hold my hand behind it so you can see. This pin is stabilizing. This is my poker pin. Now, in a perfect world, and actually mine does line up pretty good, these edges should be perfectly lined up. If yours hangs out a little bit or is a little bit shy, that means you had a little trouble with your bias, but we can hopefully fudge it if it's just a little bit, but we're gonna make sure this part lines up, and then if we have to, ease in the bias a little bit, we can do that on the other edges, not at this intersection where we want it to be perfectly lined up. So then you're gonna go ahead and sew all the way down, and I'm gonna flip this over. It's normal that this would be a little bit shy. So I'm gonna go sew that, and then I will come back and I will show you the trimming and the next step. Okay, so I have gone ahead and sewn that piece that I just had pinned. And this is what we're gonna be going for here, is we want this green to form a straight line. And that's why I had you pin that intersection, so that it's easier to get that lined up. So now we have a little bit of a jog here. So we're gonna do some trimming there as the pattern shows. So you're just gonna follow along the edge of the green, and we're gonna trim this little corner off like so. See that little bit? So now we have a nice straight line for attaching our next piece. And that's going to be this leaf unit that we made just a little bit ago. Remember, I showed it looking like this, but we are going to be turning it to have it fit together with this block. So one thing to check before you try to sew these together, if, for example, your green and your navy do not form a perfect edge, like see how my navy just hangs down just a little bit, you can go ahead and trim that just slightly before you start. So just in case your sewing with the bias edge wasn't perfect, we do have a little leeway on this because we are going to trim the whole unit when we're done. So now you can see my corner lines up better. So now we are going to put these two together along this seam here. Both of them are quite a bit of straight of grain. This has a little bit of bias, so I'm going to choose to put the green on top because it has the most straight of grain. And we are going to look again for that little valley up here and lining up that 1/4 inch seam, because we want this to be a straight edge along here. Let's turn it so you can see. We want this to form a nice straight line here, and this is going to be trimmed after along this edge. So we're going to make sure that that's lined up along the top. Again, if you want to, you can, mark that 1/4 inch seam so that you can see where that lines up, like so. And then you're going to line up all the way along the edge, and then there'll be a little extra navy that hangs below. This does not form the perfect little valley that we're looking for up here. So start sewing on this edge and sew all the way down. So I'm gonna go do that, and I will be right back. Okay, so this is the seam that I just sewed along here. And now I've pressed it, and you can see this line doesn't line up perfectly, but like I said, that's what we're gonna be trimming. And if you look closely at this intersection, you can see I have a 1/4 inch from this edge over to that point. So that's going to form a nice little corner after I sew the next seam to that. So one other thing, I press this seam towards the green. Again, I want this stem to kind of pop up. So by pressing both seams towards that green, that will help with that. And then what we're going to do is our trimming. So the pattern gives us a size of 7.5 by 20 inches. So we're gonna go 7.5 wide by 20 inches long. So I'm gonna use a couple of rulers to get that done. I have my 6 by 24, and I can see that I'm about 20 1/4 in length, and you're gonna wanna trim off the top here. That's where the excess is, not down here by the leaf. And then we want it to be 7.5 wide. So since my ruler is 6 inches wide, I'm going to borrow 1.5 inches from this ruler here, and you can see I have just a little bit to trim off there. And because I'm right-handed and my camera is in the way, I'm going to do this and trim. So you can see that little bit that gets trimmed off there. And then, like I said, we're going to go to 20 inches in length, and you can't really see where from on screen, but I have a tripod that's lined up with this right here, and so I cannot get my ruler all the way over right now, but you would trim this to 20 inches in length, like so. So just pretend that I've already done that. We'll slide that up. Then what you're going to do, and hard part is over, by the way. Like I said, that's one of the hardest intersections in the quilt, and this also to get this lined up and trimmed. But that's why I made it a little bit bigger, so there was just a little bit of leeway in case you were off to get that lined up. Now we're going to take some of our leftover leaves, and there are background pieces that you should have set aside for this step. You're going to sew them together. This should measure 20 inches in length, and then you'll be able to sew these together, and then you will have your completed stem unit. So this should measure 11.5 inches wide when you're done, and 20 inches long. Okay, I've got that last seam sewn, and I just wanted to zoom in on and show you how close this little piece is right here. So that's kind of how that should look in person. You can see it gets to be a small little bulky area. And then up here you can see I have quite a bit of distance between my top point of this block and the edge. So that's how all those intersections are supposed to look. So that's a wrap for this week. If you're making the big quilt, you'll be making 3 of these units. If you're making a table runner like I am that has the single rows in the middle, then you'll be making 2 of these. So next week we are going to, I'm just going to slide around here, we're going to work on sewing together some of these background units, and then we're going to attach that to the rows and the stem with that. So that's what we're going to do next week. Try not to make you too dizzy here. Over on my other table, I have my table runner laid out here, and we're going to be making these sections here and sewing them to the rows. So that's a wrap for this week. We'll see you back here next week where we will finish assembling quite a few parts of our quilts.